Zimbabwe, together with South Africa, Algeria, and a few other places on the continent, hold the distinct history of having been subject to settler colonialism during the colonial era, as opposed to the administrative, direct or indirect rule prevalent across the African continent. In 1889, and after King Lobengula was strong-armed into signing the Rod Concession the previous year, Cecil John Rhodes's British South African Company, BSAC, was granted the royal charter to prospect for minerals and run affairs in what is now Zimbabwe. This period of company rule would last until 1923, when the British government took over administration of what was now Southern Rhodesia. At the time, the white population, the European population, was around 40,000. For context, the black population was just under 1 million. Waves upon waves of Europeans would land on the shores of the country, peaking in 1975 at 300,000 before the raging Second Chimurenga and eventual independence saw many of them leaving the country. In 1930, the definitive law that would determine conversations surrounding land ownership in the country forever was put in place. The Land Apportionment Act was described by Southern Rhodesia's Prime Minister, Godfrey Huggins, as marking, and I quote, the first attempt in Southern Africa to effect a measure of segregation between the European and African peoples, end quote. This may well be true, seeing as South African apartheid would only kick into law 18 years later. The Land Apportionment Act specifically demarcated European and native land areas. They granted 51% of the land, of course the best, to the now 50,000 Europeans, and 30%, naturally the worst, to the more than 1 million black people. The 1930 law also established native purchase areas where blacks could buy land, and more than 80% of this land was in regions 4 and 5, the lowest of a 5-tier devaluation of agricultural land, with 1 being the best, 2 being the second best, and so forth. Basically, black people got the worst of the land and not much of it. So what happened to all the Africans who lived in these now quote-unquote European spaces? They were forcibly moved to the native areas called reserves, which is where we get the term today, reservas, for the rural areas, which in turn got crowded and thus were further depleted. And they were bad to begin with, so you can only imagine what that depletion would look like. Any Africans continuing to live on European land were deemed squatters, even though some of them had been there for hundreds of years. Indeed, even the Rhodesian authorities recognized how foul the Land Apportionment Act and its repercussions had been. Here's a quote from one Ken Brown, who was a former official of the Native Department back in 1959. He said, "It is quite embarrassing to drive through a European area into a native area. The change in soil type coincides almost exactly with the boundary line and is startlingly obvious." Prime Minister Huggins himself, 10 years prior to that, in 1949, had commented that 30% of the native reserves and about 45% of the native purchase areas are unfit for occupation by natives or their animals because of the total lack of water. So they were doing these African people dirt, and they knew what they were doing, right? So the early years of large-scale European farming were tough going. Between the regular challenges of just setting up new enterprise, they came on the back of the First World War and the Great Depression, so there was an overall drop in demand for such crops as tobacco, maize, sugar, etc. The 1950s, however, saw an agricultural revolution. Between 1948 and 1960, here are some of the statistics. Maize yields per hectare increased 155%, wheat yields by 185%, and tobacco yields 300%. Right. Fascinatingly, Rhodesia became the second country only behind the USA to release hybrid seeds for sale to farmers, which would be going to be called the Green Revolutionary Maize Variety, or SR52. So that is something that came out in the 1950s and grew to prominence in the 1960s. This period of growth, however, would be interrupted when, in 1965, the Rhodesian government broke ranks with the British Empire in what is now called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. Fundamentally disagreeing with the British government's push towards decolonization, Rhodesia became only the second colony, again after the USA, to unilaterally disaffiliate from the empire in this way since the US did it some 2 centuries earlier. As a result, the state was put under stringent international sanctions that, together with the raging Second Chimurenga, ultimately led to the majority rule and the end of the colonial era in 1980. Now, despite these debilitating sanctions, it is important to note that the country's farming and other industries endured against all odds for at least a decade. There are a few reasons for this. The first one is the government maintained tight control of enterprise, right, particularly of foreign exchange, through which they only imported goods that could not be made locally. And these included things like import priority was given to things like fertilizers, fuel, military equipment, and anything else that could be made at home would not be imported, right? That's the first thing. The second thing that happened was this issue we call sanctions busting. Even though there were these stringent sanctions that were increasingly tight, and they were UN mandated and so forth, countries continue to do business with them, chiefly among them, surprisingly, the British themselves, with the British companies supplying oil, with the government itself, the British government turning their blind eye. South Africa invested more than $600 million into the country. The US as well chimed in, at least in the 60s, drifted away in the 70s, but initially they had chimed in. So this was able to keep the country afloat. Also, because the Rhodesian government had realized earlier how important farming would be, they recognized that the sanctions were pushing farmers away from more luxury products such as tobacco to the necessities such as maize, cotton, and livestock. The Rhodesian government was put in a position to provide subsidies to these farmers. And these subsidies look like this. By the mid-1970s, they were equivalent to what is around $40,000 a year now given to these farmers, to the white farmers. And furthermore, because they were getting preference in getting this money, it further pushed African farmers out of the market, right? So, for example, in the late 1950s, African farmers had produced 30% of marketed production. By the late 1960s, it was down to 18%, so almost 50% decline, which, if you remember earlier, the fact that we spoke about how African people received the worst land and not much of it, the fact that they had even been contributing 32% of the marketable agricultural produce is incredible, but they were now being pushed further down, right? Many younger black people grew to be landless and went on to join the Second Chimurenga, which was now in full swing. So that is a bit on the history, and ultimately, right, the sanctions and the Chimurenga eventually led to the collapse of this resistance, which by the late 1970s. And some of the reasons for the collapse of this Rhodesian project as the UDI included the economic impact of the guerrilla war, which by now was costing them over $1.5 million a day. Early attempts at sanction busting had now been drastically reduced, with the borders being sealed off in a prominent way. There was the oil crisis of the 1970s, and also South Africa, which remained their chief ally in the region, was being pressured more and more into by the US and other forces to not have the Rhodesians back as much as possible. So all these things were coming into play. So by 1979, the warring parties decided to sit down and engage in what is now called the Lancaster House Agreement, which we will talk about shortly. That would eventually lead to independence in 1980. So that is a bit on the history of land contestation in Zimbabwe before independence. Here are some key takeaways in response to popular misconceptions. Misconception number 1. The Africans did not have profitable farming culture before the colonial era. So that's one thing that people say, that the Europeans, Rhodesians, introduced this idea of profitable farming. Well, this is not true. We know that for hundreds of years, African people in this particular space had been gainfully farming, right? Until the mid-1930s, both Africans and Europeans had been using the same technology, and the Europeans were just doing it on a bigger scale. So, for example, the Shangwe people of Gokwe were renowned producers of tobacco in pre-colonial days, and the industry grew in the 1920s, promoted by white traders. But thereafter, with the Land Apportionment Act, tobacco was moved to be a white crop, so that was part of the decline. Then also you have to think about the idea of a capitalistic society. It wasn't that these Africans were not producing on a large scale, but they were not operating in a system that leans on capitalism in the way that colonial societies work. So of course the scale would be dwarfed because the purpose and the economic system had shifted drastically. So that's the first thing. The second misconception is that the Europeans were just significantly better farmers, and it ties to the first one. So already we have seen that, our first point was talking about how competent Africans were. Then you also have to think about the fact that the Land Act continued to tip the odds in their favor, right? They got all the best land. They got subsidies and loans. Black farmers were continuously pushed out of the market, including some who had returned from fighting in the Second World War, who came back to be treated as second-class citizens and couldn't own land in some of the better parts of the country. So all these things. There's even reports of where white farmers would be paid more for their tobacco, even if it was the same quality and amount as the black farmer. So there's all these things to think about, right? That it is not, the apparent success is not inherent as it is systematic. Then also, we must never shy away from the fact that they also faced significant struggles, right? It took a long time to get this farming culture well implemented. And even then, they still needed the European farmers still had to get a lot of relief from the government, as we've spoken about, with the subsidies and loans and unfair advantages. And even then, there was a report that a lot of the land, right until the end, was underused. So, for example, a parliamentary committee in 1957 concluded that only 6% to 12% of the arable European land was actually being farmed. A similar report in the 1970s, 1976, showed that only 15% of potentially arable European land was being cultivated. So claims of hyper efficiency and these things are also very much understated. You can tell that this idea of primitive accumulation was a key, in which this land was just being held onto for the purposes of keeping it away from African peoples in a bid to create this apartheid-esque structure of segregation. A third misconception, which goes against the first two things that I've said, is the idea of that there's the suggestion that maybe they were not that good farmers based on everything I've said. Or let me rewind a little bit. Something else that we didn't talk about when we were talking about what gave the impression that they were significantly better farmers. Remember we spoke earlier about how people who lived in those spaces were regarded as squatters, and other black people who were seeking employment, with many even coming from as far out as Malawi, which was Nyasa land at the time. These folks would come in and stay and work on the farms for close to nothing, right? For very low incomes, borderline indentured servitude conditions. So if you have access to a workforce like that, especially if you've dispossessed people of their land and homes, then you regard them as squatters and they have to earn their keep to stay on your land. It is in a capitalist system, that is something that will give you a leg up. So that is another reason why they did so well. But back to the third point, it is not that they were, any suggestions that they were terrible farmers is also a fallacy, right? Because think about the hybrid seed we spoke about earlier, developed in the 1950s, second only to the United States of America. So that is incredible ingenuity. We can talk about even the government having the foresight to break down the country into the 5 regions, and even though as racist and oppressive as it was, just the foresight to be providing these loans during the UDI and giving these loans as a way to attract other white settlers from Britain and other places to come and settle. These were all things that were very tactical on the behalf of the government. So if we are talking about it from a system devoid from not in a value judgment system, but in a effective system way, they knew what they were doing, and it sustained them for as long as they did, even though the odds were often stacked against them. So it is important to remember these dynamics as we go into the next part of this discussion, which is where we will talk about the Lancaster House Agreement and the advent of independence, and how the land was meant to be redistributed going forward. The Lancaster House Agreements, signed in December 1979 between members of the British delegation, the Zimbabwean Rhodesian delegation, which was the compromise interim government that existed between 1978 and 1979, and the Patriotic Front, led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo as leaders of ZANU and ZAPU respectively, were the seminal negotiations that facilitated Zimbabwe's first democratic elections and, as such, the advent of independence. Here are some of the main points agreed upon at the Lancaster House Agreements. First of all, the minority white population would retain at least 20 seats in the 100-person parliament up until 1987, so for the first 7 years. Secondly, the new state would inherit a $200 million debt from the outgoing government, right? And agreed to pay pensions to all Rhodesian civil servants, even those who had since emigrated. The liberation forces, right, so the quote-unquote guerrillas, were put in a position where they had to integrate into the what they call the regular, quote-unquote regular army, but that means that they had to integrate into the Rhodesian army, right? Those are the existent national structures. So you can already see what tensions that may as well lead to. But the major sticking point, however, was the issue of land. The Rhodesians, and especially the white farmers, were not prepared to let go of their privilege that was represented by land ownership, especially as they went into an era in which they did not have political privilege anymore in an independent Zimbabwe. But on the other hand, the leaders, particularly the Patriotic Front leaders, were not willing to abate. They were not willing to let that go. That's what the war for independence had been about to them, right? So they were not willing to sign anything if the land was not, if land reform and land redistribution was not a major part of the conversation. So what do? Finally, the moderators of the agreements came up with this with sort of compromise in which the land could not be confiscated, but would have to be sold on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. So the white farmers who owned these large-scale farms and other sort of holdings would have to be willing to sell them, and the government would have to be willing to buy them. However, the government, remember we just said they inherited that debt, they were not in any position to, even if they were willing, they would not be able to buy it. So the agreement was finally passed on the promise of the Americans under the Carter administration and the British under the Thatcher administration to fund to buy and develop these white-owned lands, right? So that was the promise. When the time came, they would help fund significantly so the process of buying these farms and compensating the white farmers for their development. All right. So put a pin in that. That will become important. Now, despite the big deal made about the land at Lancaster House, land redistribution proved to be very slow after independence. On one hand, the government invested heavily in smallholder farming, most of whom were black, such that between 1980 and 1985, they had become the largest suppliers of cotton and maize to formal markets. My own grandparents, Gogo and Sekuru Mavima, indeed put my father and his younger siblings through school in large part due to their small-scale cotton farming. On the other hand, redistribution efforts fell way below the target. For example, while it had been decided that land would be distributed to 162,000 families by the end of the 1980s, with more to be done thereafter, only 75,000 families had been resettled by 1997. That's less than half of the first decade estimates 17 years later. This was for a few fundamental reasons. First of all, the willing buyer, willing seller narrative is dependent on, well, the seller being willing to sell. And with the sanctions of the UDI era gone and the market on the up and up, many were not willing to sell. Besides, a lot of their white settler privilege rested in ownership of the land, now more important to them since they had lost political privileges by way of independence. Furthermore, the willing seller gets to price their product, and often the farms will be priced out of the government's budget. For example, between 1986 and 1989, just under 2,000 farms were offered, but the offers were not accepted because the asking price was almost 10 times the amount being paid by the government for farms at the time. So the farms ended up being sold to other white farmers, often at much lower prices than they had been offered to the government, which set a pattern of white farmers who decided to remain collecting several farms. So this is the way in which the white farmers protected their little cartel, right? Which was to price the farms out of the government's reach and then sell them. But that's how it is when it's a willing buyer, willing seller system. You can do that. Secondly, despite the primacy of the land issue during the Second Chimurenga and indeed the Lancaster House agreements, the government did not place top priority to the land reform after independence. Even away from the willing seller, willing buyer model, they barely engaged the alternatives. What were these alternatives that were provided? Well, it had been a 1981 mandate had said immediate access to more and better land was essential for raising incomes of the rural poor, and it called for a land tax to encouraged less used land to be offered for sale and the creation of land purchase bonds that would guarantee payment in hard currency but only at a later date. None of these things were followed up on, right? So this is for a few reasons. First of all, the financial gain of it all made the maintenance of large-scale farming preferable to breaking down the farms. These farms were very profitable. So not only were they profitable to the white farmers, but they were profitable to the larger economy of the country. And the government was pretty content with that. Secondly, proclamations of reconciliation at independence led the government to desperately try and prevent white flight, which is something that had happened in Mozambique and Angola with the Portuguese some 5 or 6 years earlier. Right. So they were desperate to hold on to the white population of the country as a show of reconciliation, but also because of the economic role they played. Also, where the land transferred hands to black people, it was to the black elites. 350 black people bought large farms and 600 leased them in that first decade, which is a far cry from the narrative of the masses owning the land, right? It's not enough to exchange a large-scale white farmer with a large-scale black farmer at the expense of the masses, right? White capitalist, black capitalist, all the same. Well, ideologically so. In a nutshell, the white farmers were determined to hold on to the gains of colonial primitive accumulation by way of the farms, and the revolutionary government did not want to rock the boat too much. So for the first decade and then some, they kept chilly chill. But you know who did not keep chilly chill though? Many members of the civil society, particularly the landless peasantry and those who had been deemed squatters since the colonial era and now into the independence era. So I will now look at the land uprisings, the appropriation of the movement by the Mugabe regime by the way of the third Chimurenga, and the fallout therefrom, before we conclude with the recent narrative of whether the white farmers should be paid as has been declared by the Mnangagwa administration or not. Despite the Lancaster House provisions and the rhetorical centrality of land as national project, redistribution proved to be slow and fell far beneath the targets in the first 2 decades. The government, seemingly content with the miracle, quote-unquote, of a post-colonial Zimbabwe, buoyed in large part by the economic contributions of the white large-scale commercial farmers who had retained the land, appeared lethargic in the pursuit of the comprehensive land redistribution for which they had vehemently fought. This obviously suited the farmers well. Soon, however, the landless peasantry began to express frustrations at the betrayal of the nation's post-colonial imaginary that heavily rested on the land. The absence of comprehensive agricultural reform also became a metaphor for what the public perceived to be ineptness and a lack of commitment to the socialist ideals and post-colonial reforms that the government had promised. As economic frustrations grew, added to in large part by the catastrophic Economic Structural Adjustment Plan, or ESAP, of the early 90s, the decade culminated in the definitive popular expression of frustration surrounding the coloniality of land in Zimbabwe. Beginning in 1997, villages, led prominently by veterans of the Second Chimurenga, or aka the war vets, began invading unused and underutilized land, the enduring colonial excesses of the white farmers. Although dozens of occupations would take place between then and the turn of the century, the 1998 invasion of farms in Shoshe and Chikwaka, both in Mashonaland East, elevated the discourse surrounding occupations to a national level. While the mainstream historical narrative suggests that the land reform was the brainchild and sole initiative of the Mugabe government, it is critical to recognize that its birth as a grassroots movement. If anything, The government was vehemently opposed to these initial occupations, with the police arresting leaders of the occupation movements, the vice president being deployed to negotiate the villagers' withdrawal from the farms. While many of these first wave occupiers conceded and withdrew from the farms, the people had spoken, and the first salvo by a land of hungry and increasingly restless peasantry had, however, been fired. While the 1998 Mashonaland East farm invasions incontrovertibly put into motion the series of events culminating in the land redistribution, it is critical to acknowledge the different communities around the country, often dubbed squatters, that had continuously advocated for land reform, with their cries often falling on deaf governmental ears. As early as 1985, for example, settlers at the Killarney squatter camp, consisting of 3 villages, including the Two-Stamp, Xhosa, and Chaka, and at one time comprising of 4,000 families, refused to be resettled unless the government will resettle us on arable land so that we revert to what we know best, farming, and I end quote. That's a direct quotation from some of the quote-unquote squatters. That the overwhelmingly accepted genesis for the land invasion is not only in Mashonaland, but places the war veterans, traditionally sympathetic to ZANU-PF, at the center of the narrative, is consistent with the top-down, ethnocentric, selective articulation of history, definitive of Mugabeism. While the place of war veterans in Zimbabwean society vacillates between that of the common man and the political elite, the indisputable yet marginalized voice of the landless peasantry can never be understated. Despite the evolution of the colloquial narrative into one that equates the entirety of the land reform process with Mugabeism, the call for land redistribution was most loudly uttered by the poor and landless in an independent Zimbabwe, and its theoretical importance is widely appreciated outside the scope of government and formal politics as a whole. There are 2 critical sequences at the end of the 20th century through which the previously lethargic Mugabe government was thrust into synonymity with the land redistribution. The first, alluded to in the previous section, was the increasing political pressure leveled by the landless masses and war veterans who were feeling the despair of worsening economic conditions in the aftermath of the ISAP era. The financial compensation given out in 1997 by the government after relentless lobbying from the war vets had set a precedent that would haunt Mugabe until he left power, and that is the precedent that he would acquiesce to the whims of the war veterans lobbying. In fact, there's a quote here that is an infamous quote in which the Minister of Finance came to Mugabe in 1997 and remarked that the planned payouts to the war veterans in 1997 would bankrupt the country, to which Mugabe scoffed, "How can a country possibly be bankrupted?" Well, he was about to find out soon. But in any case, the other sequence was the reneging of the UK and USA on the Lancaster House commitment to fund the land redistribution efforts in an independent Zimbabwe. Mugabe and Nkomo had famously refused to proceed with the 1979 negotiations until a roadmap for land redistribution was put in place, and the agreement was only reached when the British and American governments conceded to providing financial support to the Zimbabwean government to compensate the farmers. As the 21st century beckoned, however, the government had fallen well under its intended redistribution targets, and attempts to expedite the process with the help of the honored promise from the Western powers were stonewalled. In a now historic communique, British Secretary of State for International Development Claire Short retorted to attempts at further conversation with, and I quote, "I should make it clear we do not accept that Britain has a special responsibility to meet the cost of land purchase in Zimbabwe. We are a new government from diverse backgrounds without links to former colonial interests. My own origins are Irish, and, as you know, we were colonized, not colonizers," end quote. Which is one of the most ridiculous geopolitical statements I've ever heard, and I won't even get into unpacking how silly that notion is. But in any case, thus, the unrelenting ire towards the Western powers, combined with the growing urgency of land reform to quickly manifest into the enduring hallmarks of Mugabeism. The government sought to appeal to the popular memory of the sacrifice of the armed struggle and the inherent enmity of whites at home or abroad. The Fast-Track Land Reform Program, FTLRP, implemented beginning in July 2000 to resettle thousands, was dubbed the Third Chimurenga. This inherently militarized the process and situated it in the same continuum as the resistance efforts of Mbuyanehanda for the first Chimurenga, then Sipra and Zanla in the second Chimurenga. Any vacillation by the government ended by November 2000 when they ran newspaper adverts declaring that the land is your land. Don't let the white farmers use the courts and constitution against the masses. The third Chimurenga was sustained in the psyche of the populace by a collection of incessant jingles and songs, mostly borrowed from wartime archives and curated by Jonathan Moyo, who was then the Minister of Information. The jingles, often carrying the celebratory tone of wartime Pungwe songs, were complemented by popular songs from an array of popular artists. Comrade Chinks, for example, who had famously been one of the leaders of the Zanla choir during the second Chimurenga, reprised his role as lead chanter of the struggle, this time updating several of his wartime songs to include land reappropriation as a new phase of anti-imperialism. Comrade Chinks' third Chimurenga songs adopted a racialized tone that reiterated the enmity of the white farmers and whites as a whole, a tone whose racial departure from the conciliatory one of early years mirrored that of the Mugabe's administration as a whole. Now, and also it is very important at this point, and I cannot talk about the Mugabe government being thrust into a space to redistribute the land without mentioning this. And this is a key factor. This would be a third factor if I was to list the three things that led to this. The rise of the movement for democratic change as a political party, the first very legitimate opposition party in Zimbabwe, its rise in the late 90s, right? And there was in early 2000, there was a referendum to amend the constitution, which was led by ZANU-PF. And for the first, and people voted no overwhelmingly. This would have given the president more powers and these things. And the people voted no overwhelmingly, right? And this was the first time that a vote had not gone ZANU-PF's way. Now, combined with the rise of the MDC as a political party, and as I just said, that was a party that was heavily supported by the white farmers and by foreign interests as well. You can see now why the Mugabe government was spurred into this land redistribution, as they did it in a way to usurp and be able to delineate themselves as the anti-imperialist party, as opposed to these other guys who they were framing as being in the West's pockets. Whether by virtue of being on the government's payroll, opportunistically jumping aboard the land reform train for publicity, or a genuine effort to expedite the land redistribution of land in Zimbabwe, it is clear that pro-land reform expressions adopted several modes and platforms. It is also clear that, at least retrospectively, Zimbabweans across the political, socio-economic, and generational spectrum feel that the land reform was necessary. This in no way implies that support for the land reform among the masses has been unanimous. It has been anything but. And in this next section, I will talk about some of the uglier parts of the land redistribution. The first thing to think about when we talk about the land redistribution and its negatives is the blatant violence that accompanied it. Despite the relatively peaceful origins of the land resettlement movement, the Wolverts-led Third Chimurenga did take a more lawless turn as it progressed. This was in large part due to the growing frustration of war vets and the poverty-stricken masses in peri-urban and rural areas, and the stiff resistance put up by the farmers and the government's polarity as they rhetorically supported the reform and yet struggled to enforce it and provide support for the potential and new landowners. With the war vets led by the ominously nicknamed Chenjerai, Hitler, Hundri, FTLRP farm invasions became more violent and disorderly, earning the colloquial moniker Jambanja, which translates loosely to spontaneous violence in Shona. All right, let's go back to this. This man's nickname was Hitler. Ain't that crazy? I remember growing up around, when I was a kid, when this was going on, and I just thought, that's some, gangster historical name. It's only now when I got older and I fully appreciated who Hitler was that I realized just how wild it was that this guy was on the news being announced as Hitler. But in any case, the violence coincided with a surge in political violence as well, as ZANU-PF responded to the unprecedented threat posed by the MDC in the 2000 and 2002 elections. In many recollections of the violence of the era then, narratives often speak of the two symbiotically, and criticism thereof have appeared accordingly. Human Rights Watch has the casualties of the third Chimurenga at 3,000, though that number may be higher, and of course doesn't account for the other forms of loss due to violence. The FTLRP's violent turn instantly polarized even those sympathetic to the cause of land redistribution. Pundits brought to the forefront the victimization of not only the white farmers, many of whom had the economic means to absorb the losses, but also the black masses meant to be benefiting from the process. Critics not only repudiated the violence as a moral or civil matter, but because the narrative of human rights abuses tainted the already controversial land reform and became the justification for the country's marginalization by the global community. It was in apparent response to this violence that the USA, European Union, and Australia placed sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2002 and 2003, further sending the country's economy into a downward spiral. One of the people that I spoke to during this research, a good friend of mine who's a community activist in Zimbabwe, explained that the land reform was a great idea. The idea of giving land back to the indigenous owners, or at least making sure that the land was shared, but the way it was administered, it was a disaster. It was done in a way that bordered on reckless and inhumane, and the economy took a big hit as a result. We should have done better as a country. So that's a little bit about the violence. Another critique that comes up is that of lack of investment in the human capital of farming. Harkening back to Thomas Mapfumo's seemingly prophetic refrain from 1991, Maiti kurima ignore, which means you thought farming was easy. A recurrent criticism of the land reform has been that it handed the crucial industry to people who severely underprepared for the task at hand. The contemporaneous economic collapse that accompanied the FTLRP is often cited as evidence of a cataclysmic misstep on the part of the government. A 2006 land audit revealed that 44% of all the new farmers who had received land as part of the FTLRP were either underutilizing or not utilizing it at all. So people were lamenting that, as I spoke to different people about this, with somebody else saying, we were just taking the land back from people who took the land from us. Unfortunately, some of the people who got the land aren't productive. And you get this sort of things. However, if you remember earlier on in the video, we also spoke about how even during the colonial era, when whites were in full control of the land, a lot of it also went underutilized. So that is not necessarily a new phenomenon. I'm not defending it, but I'm also saying it's important to put it within historical context, right? That this is not a new thing that points to black failure. Somebody else I spoke to explained this. If you take, for example, 1,000 acres and give it to me, I have no experience in chicken rearing or animal husbandry. I can't plant on it. At the end of the day, if it's supposed to be producing maize and nothing is happening, there's no point. It just won't work. At the end of the day, we need to empower people, give them specific knowledge, find people who may be doing farming at a small scale, teach them to do it at a bigger scale. That way it benefits everybody. Empower them first before giving them the land. If I'm a mechanic and you give me land, by the end of the year you'll find cars parked on fertile land. So this is sort of the mentality that people had. The debates here thus become that between ownership of the nation for nationalism's sake versus for the sake of functionalism. That is to say, does the mantra Africa for Africans, as led by Marcus Garvey, mean it should be reserved for the Africans and up to them however they utilize it, or should claims to land be based on one's productivity on land? So this is the second thing. Closely tied to that last one, in which people were not empowered, is that of cronyism. The other criticism is cronyism. And let's take this quote from the play Ivu versus the State, in which one of the characters says, "But now affirmative action affirms the chosen few. Indigenous businesses is business for a few who are more indigenous than others." To which the other actor responds, "It's like rats in a cage. As the food keeps coming, they get fatter and fatter, and then you turn off the food and they start eating each other." While referencing indigenous businesses in general, the consummate indigenized industry benefiting from affirmative action at the turn of the century was farming via the FTLRP. The particularly telling reference here is that to a few who are more indigenous than others. And this is sort of part of the creation of the Mugabeist narrative, right, in which people are selected as a caste of this sort of culturally nativist people who are worthy of this, who are allied with the government, who got the land. Frantz Fanon criticized this phenomenon as one of the main pitfalls of post-colonial nationalism, wherein the exclusive bourgeoisie, whose primary interest is to transfer into native hands of those unfair advantages which are the legacy of the colonial period. Popular dissent against cronyism is particularly emphatic surrounding the FTLP because it is associated with the incompetence and ill preparation that many regard as having led to the country's economic collapse. A prominent scholar and personal mentor to me, Douglas Mpondi, has gone as far as proclaiming that Zimbabwe is now a colony of the political elites and the land barons and cabals who purport to represent the interests of the majority but are enriching themselves. Thus, even as contemporary studies have suggested, end quote, less than 5% of the land recipients fit the definition of cronies, popular perception argue that this number is much higher, much to the detriment of an otherwise noble process. And the final drawback I'll talk about here is that of gender imbalances. Already marginalized by traditional and colonial era land and property ownership policies, women enter the Zimbabwean post-colonial national project already facing an uphill task in pursuit of liberation and equality. The marginalization of women in the new Zimbabwe confronted the nation as a whole as it stood on the precipice of land redistribution. Women were at the forefront of the FTLRP. This is a quote. Participating alongside men in the struggle to gain access to the land, end quote. Organizations such as Women and Land in Zimbabwe and Women Farmers Land and Agricultural Trust, founded in 1998 and 2006 respectively, are examples of organizations providing logistical and advocacy support for women farmers. The labor has not been in vain, as the government reserved 20% of the land redistributed for women, and unlike the Colonial Era Communal Lands Act, female farmers under the FTLRP had full control of their land allocated to them, regardless of marital or familial standing. These policy gains, however, have not necessarily translated into reality. Women still make up more than half of the population and lead almost 40% of the households in the country, with the majority of these households in rural areas. Thus, the 20% allocation, which is translated into 18% in reality, still represents an underrepresentation of women as custodians of the national project that is land redistribution in Zimbabwe. So a little bit about that. Now, to the part that I'm sure you guys have all been waiting for. We will talk real quick about how the land reform looks like now, and whether the white farmers, whether the Mnangagwa government was right in committing to pay back to compensate the white farmers for the land. And that is what we'll talk about in this coming section. So, what's up with this compensation deal? And for that, let me refer to one of the scholars who has dedicated some time to studying this very particular phenomenon. So I will be quoting directly from them for a little bit. This is Takura Jangaja in his recent article titled Zim's Land Compensation Deal, a Historical Sanctification of Private Property and Equality. And he explains, I quote, "The Zimbabwean government in July 2020 signed what is referred to as a Global Compensation Deed, GCD, with quote-unquote former farmers. The latter being mainly former white commercial farmers as represented by, in the agreement, the Commercial Farmers Union, that's SACFA Zimbabwe, and Valuation Consortium Private Limited. The GCD was signed after what can be considered an exclusive 24 July 2020 referendum where members of the above cited organizations with a whopping 94% vote count, which amounted to 2,801 voters, accepted the Zimbabwean government's offer. The agreement, it turns out, has been long in the making, including previous negotiations that involved the late Robert Mugabe's administration. As a result of the international political and private capital outcry of the fast-track land reform program (FTRP) at the turn of the century. While a full summary of the GCD's contents and timeline are available at a website that I will put in the description, there are some that I will highlight for the purposes of this short write-up. I'm still quoting here, right? For example, the GCD establishes that Zimbabwe will compensate the white former farmers for physical farm improvements, biological assets, and land clearing to an agreed cumulative total of US $3.5 billion, with half of it expected to be raised and paid out in the next 12 months, and thereafter quarterly payments depending on the funds raised. With the expectation that some of the money will be raised via debt instrument with a 30-year guarantee on the international market from the Zimbabwean market, a development that immediately turns colonial injustice into public debt of those that struggled against it, and that the CFU will be key in assessing claims by the former farmers. Current Zimbabwe President Emmerson Mnangagwa also described the GCD as being one that brings to closure the national land question while affirming our government's commitment to rule of law and respect of property rights. He adds, "Our land has been permanently reunited with the people and the people permanently reunited with their land. The land reform program is theirs, irreversible." End quote and end quote. So, what do I think about this as Shingi Mavima? Well, the first thing is I think the president is wrong in his assessment here. What do I mean by that? Well, if indeed, as the misconception goes, that they are not being paid for the land, they are being paid for their developments on the land and biological assets and such, we need to understand that those things, one, were developed by way of primitive accumulation. This is stolen land, right? This was land that African people were dispossessed from. So the developments that came with it, one, usually were financed by that primordial theft, by that primordial dispossession of African people, right? Okay. And secondly, they made a killing for decades based on that stolen land and that development. What I would equate it to, imagine if somebody kidnapped a child and put them to school. And the child did chores around their house. It brought them much joy and all these things. And they kidnapped this kid. Then one day the parents of the kid, the biological parents of the kid who've been looking for the kid, find the kid. And then they are asked to compensate the family that kidnapped the kid for educating the kid and these things. Well, no, right? Because one, there's an original crime here upon which this child was obtained. And secondly, you make it seem as if all you did was benefit the kid when the kid also brought you much joy and did stuff for you and this thing. So it's not... So that's the first thing. That's the first thing which I feel, flies in the face of this idea of this being a revolutionary idea. Secondly, and closely related to this idea of paying or compensating the farmers for these things further increases the gap that the land revolution was supposed to combat. What do I mean by that? Well, say these farmers who are no longer farmers, right, get this money and they invest it in tech businesses, right? And that money could have gone to the farmers who took their place, to the small-scale land owners and small-scale farmers or other enterprises like that from people who were previously disenfranchised during the colonial era, right? So when you do that, they open these tech businesses and they start to thrive off of it. They have benefited from that original theft of the land once more. They've been compensated for their theft of the land and things that came with it, right? That gap, the whole point of revolution of a land reform program was not just on some sentimental black people own the land, Africa for Africans. It was a real economic empowerment move, right? Which this totally undoes. So, and I think my man Mnangagwa here explains it well here, and I quote, "What remains more important in my view is the ideological justification of the GCD, which is a full embrace of neoliberalism by the Zimbabwean government, and the intention by Mnangagwa and the globalized financial capital to treat this particular development as inevitable, while forgetting that inevitability does not make historical, social, and economic justice." Boom. So that's exactly what I'm saying, right? That we've taken this money from a Zimbabwe that is cash-strapped, by the way, that is broke, that owes billions of dollars to different entities at a time of COVID, right? Where we need to invest in COVID and people are ill-placed to find ventilators, hospitals underfurnished, and people have been out of work. We found $3.5 billion to compensate people who apparently we revolted, the revolted against not once, not twice, but 3 times if you take the third Chimurenga, quote unquote, for what it was claimed to be, only to pay them for their pains. And why is this happening? Well, as has been explained, the idea is to get back into the good graces of the international community, right? The Western powers that be. Okay? And hopefully if they smile on us and lift the targeted sanctions, it goes along with the Mnangagwa mantra of, quote unquote, Zimbabwe is open for business. Whereas that is not the fundamental shift that is needed to prove the ease of doing business in Zimbabwe. This issue of human rights that we keep talking about, the abuse of the people and these sort of things, those are the sort of things that would go a long way in showing that, unless you're really just operating in a neoliberal space in which the freedom of the small man of the little man is peripheral to what you are doing, right? To the national project. That's the only way in which this idea of compensating people who you swore you fought against to reclaim this land. Now you're paying them for it at the expense of the nation, right? And when I say the expense of the nation, I just don't mean that the money could have been used for the nation. But as Jangaza explained earlier, this money is going to be funded by taxpayers. A large part of it will come from taxpayers, many of whom are struggling to make ends meet themselves. So historically, long-term politically, nationalistically, if you will, if that's a word, this decision, I think, is foul, and it flies in the face of the very revolution that Mnangagwa, bear in mind that even though Mnangagwa removed Mugabe from power, he was part and parcel of the revolution through and through. You know, he fought in the armed struggle, which centered the land, reclaiming the land as being a key goal. He was part of the administration, Mugabe's administration, for 3 decades, which means he was part and parcel of the Hondo Yamin of the third Chimurenga of the turn of the century. So he's been there. This is not a radical departure by somebody who has always felt differently. And frankly, this betrays the revolution. This betrays the struggle, and this betrays the people of Zimbabwe. And let me say this because I can see this coming already. This is not me being a Mugabe sympathizer or a sympathizer of Mugabeism or anything like that. We can critique both the human rights abuses and the economic collapse of Zimbabwe, and still appreciate that the land had to be redistributed, that it had set up a very unbecoming dynamic through which the Europeans, the Rhodesians, would perpetually remain wealthy, right? And this just goes on to affirm that this sort of rich get richer, poor get poorer ideal, that money should be redirected and used for the uplift of the Zimbabwean people. And those are my thoughts on this issue. If you have any further comments, I'll leave a lot of my sources in the description section. But if you have anything else, please let me know what you think of this issue in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. And power to the people, man. And